message today is called Focus. And we start at Exodus chapter 17, starting in verse 1. This is the beginning of Exodus, where they've come out into the desert. They haven't been there that long, less than 2 years. It says, and all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin, and their journeys according to the certain commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Problem. This isn't the first time they had a problem. They got 3 days out in the wilderness and they didn't have any. So it's not like they don't know that God's not going to provide for them. That God is going to provide. They know that, but we see the reaction. Therefore the people did chide with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, why chide ye with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord? We're saying, well, why are you on my case? I don't create water. You have to talk to God. He's the one that does that. Why are you tempting God? What do you mean? Well, it's like they know God provides. You don't get up into God's face to get what you want from God. You go to him because he's the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He's your creator. He will provide for you, but you ask, when you want someone to do you a favor, you don't get up in their face. You ask them nicely. So much even more for God. And the people, verse 3, thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? There's no recognition of what God's done. Remember, he gave them 10 signs and wonders in Egypt. He takes them through the Red Sea on dry ground, and the Egyptians get drowned, which proves that God was in it. And then he takes them out in the wilderness. He gives them water. He takes bad water and turns it into good water. He gives them manna, and they're complaining each and every time. Instead of asking God, instead of trusting God. So, verse 4, Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, what shall I do unto these people? They be almost ready to stone me. He wants to know what to do. He says, they're ready to kill me. Which is interesting, because it's like, but it's not really about Moses. It is about God. But he relates it to himself. Somehow he introduces himself into the equation. But he has nothing to do with it. He's just bringing his petitions, the petitions to God. He's essentially putting himself in a position that God hasn't given him. Yeah, he's a leader. But more than that, he's actually the intermediary between the people and God. God speaks to him face to face. Verse 5, and the Lord said to Moses, go on before the people, take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod, wherewith thou smote the river, take in your hand and go. It says, behold, I will stand before you there upon the rock in Horeb. Horeb was also Mount Sinai, same place. And thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, and the people, that the people may drink. And Moses did in the sight of all Israel, all the elders of Israel. So God says, take your staff, strike the rock. I'll be standing in front of you. Strike the rock just once, and the water's going to come up. Straightforward. He does this. Everything works fine. Now, what happens the second time around? We get on to Numbers chapter 20, starting verse 1. This is after a number of years in the wilderness. Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, unto the desert of Zin in the first month. And the people abode in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. And there was no water for the congregation. It's a wilderness. Basically a desert. Of course there's no water. Certainly not enough for any one person. I mean, it's for not 600,000 men. It's just not. And there was no water for the congregation, and they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. Still not focused on God. Still focused on the people who represent God. Still ungrateful to God for what he's given them. Verse 3, and the people chode with Moses and spake, saying, would God that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Well, don't worry, this can be arranged. But anyway, verse 4, why have you brought up the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our cattle should die here? Well, that was already explained to them. That was already explained. There's a whole generation has to die off because they didn't believe God in the first place. But they don't want to focus on their mistake. And wherefore have you, verse 5, made us come up out of Egypt? Nobody made anybody go up out of Egypt. To bring us into this evil place. It is no place of seed or of figs or of vines or of pomegranates, neither is there any water to drink. And Moses and Aaron went up from the presence of the assembly unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, like before, and they fell upon their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto them. And the Lord spake unto Moses, again, same way, same deal, right? Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock. He didn't say strike it. First time he said strike it. This time he's saying, just speak to it. Now think, this is a promotion. The first time he strikes the rock. But the second he says, you don't even have to strike the rock. Just speak to the rock. That's more power. You have to strike it. You have to do it. Just speak it. And it happens, right? Speak unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. And thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock. So thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. Before we go any further, it's like, why water out of the rock? What's that all about? Remember, the whole wilderness experience is very much the experience that we have. Okay? God has a promised land for all of us, a place where we receive the fullness of the blessing of God that He's promised us. He promises. But to get there, you got to go through a wilderness experience, a dry place. This is interesting because, first of all, you're denied everything from the world. The things that got you excited about the world, that disappears out of the way. And so you have to decide, well, do I want to go back into Egypt, which is a type of the world, or I want to get through the wilderness into God's promise? But this is a spiritual place. Egypt is all natural. It's all the flesh. But the promised land is all about the spirit. Now, when you're in the right place in the spirit, you get all the natural stuff too. So it's like double or nothing. You can go back to what you had, or you can get double what you had before. Essentially, because you have the spiritual part. The Bible says, the blessings of the Lord makes rich, and He adds no sorrow with it. Egypt, they were slaves. And when we're in the world, we are slaves to the world. How do you know that? What happens Monday morning? I leave it at that. Everybody crawls himself out of bed, sometimes early in the morning, to get to work, the slave to get off. Yes, we're slaves all right. They just don't own us. Well, not that way. They own us all right. The mortgages, the loans, they own us. But anyway, so we have a choice to make. Do we go back to Egypt? We can't really be happy in Egypt because we end up slaves. Or do we want the promised land? But the problem with the promised land isn't the promised land. The problem with the promised land is getting there. It's the wilderness problem, where I don't have Egypt, but I don't have the promise either. The worst of both worlds. You don't have the goodies, you don't have the promise. That's the place, the wilderness experience, is where we work on ourselves, who we are, dealing with ourselves. Nobody really wants to deal with themselves. And all of Egypt, all of Israel, they spent 40 years in the wilderness. They never really did deal with themselves. By which I mean, they always wanted to do their own thing. They never wanted to really appreciate what they had because all they could see was what they didn't have. They talked about having the garlics and leeks in Egypt and lots of bread, and well, that was then. But this is now. And they were just complaining about what they didn't have. They never thanked God for what they did have. They didn't thank God for 40 years in the wilderness. Their shoes never wore out. Their clothes never wore out. Of course, there was no Macy's either, but they always had clothes. They always had food. He gave them manna. They never talked about that. They never showed appreciation for that. They just complained about what they didn't have whenever they ran into a lack. And you see, God brings lack into our life. Why? To look to God. Now, when we can take care of ourselves and what we need, who needs God? I got a fat paycheck, I got savings, I got an IRA, I got good health, I got a great HMO. What did you say I need God for? Yeah, that's how people are, right? He says, okay, so He introduces need into our lives. Why? So that we can turn to him and he can take care of that need. Not in a natural way that we all do, where we slave over whatever to get it, or do whatever we got to do. He brings us, he can provide for it, not naturally, but supernaturally. Supernatural provision for God. Like water out of the rock. Now, why water out of the rock? The rock is the Lord Jesus Christ. Is the cornerstone. And the water represents life. And there's life that comes out of the rock. Remember what Jesus said? He said, out of me will flow waters will flow living waters. And out of us too. The same thing can happen. He says, you'll never thirst again. And there is that. And he never lied about that. Because you'll lose that spiritual thirst for the world and for the other things, because he fulfills all of your needs. And as you get closer to him, he fulfills more and more of your wants, to the point where it's like, what do I want? I don't really have any wants. It's like he's taking care of all of my needs, all of my wants. Water from the rock. So, that was a diversion and an advertised special. Okay, so we come back. So the Lord spake unto Moses, said, take your rod, gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes. And thou shalt give forth his water, and thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock. So thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. Moses took the rod from before the Lord, as he commanded him. So far so good. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said unto them, hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of the rock? Where did that come from? None of that happened the first time around. He recognized that it was God doing it the first time, but now he's talking about you rebels. They haven't changed. Where'd that come from? Well, but this is the same guy who was told, speak to it, and he strikes the rock twice instead. Sounds like rebellion to me. What's the easiest thing you can see? Your own problem. And other people. It's like hindsight. You look at it, it's like, I can see rebellion all over him. Why? It's like looking in the mirror. So here you know, you rebels. So he sees it all right. Must we fetch you water out of the rock? He's not fetching anything out of the rock. He's supposed to be speaking to it, and it comes out. Must we? When did God give him the authority? He told him to speak it, not to strike it. So he was getting full of himself. His focus is messed up. All of a sudden, he seems to know better than God because he feels he can strike the rock twice instead of speaking to it. So when did he get to know more than what God knew? We don't know. Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod, he smote the rock twice. Not even once like the first time. He's got to strike it twice. He's going in exactly the opposite direction. And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. Sounds good. Is it a big deal? Yes, it's a big deal. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because you believed me not. He didn't believe. He believed he had to strike the rock. Why did he believe that? Not because he didn't hear God, but because he felt he had to do something. Why? It was all about pride and arrogance. This can't be done without me. I have to do something. I have to strike the rock, and then the water will come up. If he speaks to it, it's like that's not really doing anything, right? He's just speaking. So he felt he had to strike the rock instead. The Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, because you believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. Now, that might seem severe. It's like Israel was in the desert. They were doing all this crazy stuff. They were complaining to God, this, that, and the other. And God said, well, you're all going to die in the desert anyway, so whatever. But now Moses, he really, really, really wanted to get into that promised land. He saw it in visions. He knew what it was that God had for them. He was excited about it. And for one mistake, couldn't go in. And like I said, it sounds severe. Except, of all these people, God himself said, there's only one person I see face to face. He said, prophets I talk to in dreams and visions all the time. He said, but when Aaron and Miriam took him on, he said, but Moses I talk to face to face. He sees me. I see him. In fact, he spent so much time in the presence of God that his face actually shone. He had to have a veil over his face because it spooked everybody out. His face shone all the time. So he put a veil on his face so people wouldn't get spooky. Because he knew God that way, because he had that kind of relationship, God said, I know you. I know your name. This is a big deal in the Old Testament. If you know a person's name, you know something about them. You know them. I think of the 7 sons of Sceva when the demon spoke to him and said, Jesus I know, and Paul I know. But who are you? It's all about identification in the Holy Spirit. And so he knew God in a way that nobody else knew God. So he knew better. And this was his disqualification. Because he didn't do what God called him to do, and he knew exactly what God told him to do. He overrode that instead because he wanted to get involved in the process. He wanted to feed his ego. He wanted to be something, which is crazy because he was already as much as he could be. I mean, everybody knew who Moses was, and everybody reverenced Moses because they knew he had the power of God. But for some reason, he felt he had to introduce himself into that process. And it's like it disqualified him. Knowing God that way, it disqualified him. And you say, oh, but he led Israel through he did not lead Israel through the wilderness. He was their leader, yes. But he was their leader only in the context that God told him what to do. If you had a boss that stood over you all day and told you what to do, does that make you a leader? Yes and no. It makes it makes God a leader through you, but it doesn't make you a leader. It's like you're a radio. You're just repeating what God says. It's like me. I'm a radio. I'm giving you the message of God. It has nothing to do with me. So, the situation was, he thought of himself more highly than what he is, because he still walked around like everybody else. He still put on his pants one leg at a time like everybody else does. Although I didn't wear pants, but that's a different it's all about recognizing we're nothing. Why did God move through Moses like that? Because he was the most humble man ever lived. So he could get out of the way so God could move through him to do these signs and wonders. But he wasn't perfect. He didn't deal with this because, like I said, this was the second time around. He had this problem also with the feeding other people, and God brought the quails. Second time around, he had the same complaint as well. He said, well, can you do this? And God said, is my arm short? I can do this. Fed them all for a whole month on quails that he brought. But we tend to think of God as being able to do what we can do, but not more. But he's God. Of course he can do more. We should expect him to do more because he's God. If we serve him, we should expect more. The part that we can do, we should do. But the part that we can't do, he wants us to bring that to him and say, I can't do this. I recognize I can't do it, but I'm trusting you to be able to do what I can't do. It's important. We need to do that. Because we're all in that wilderness. We just got to decide, do we want to make it as miserable as possible by complaining? Or do we want to put the best spin on it by actually trusting him and seeing it through to the end? For me, I'm in the wilderness anyway. I better make the best of it. If I got to eat lizards, I'm going to eat lizards. Maybe a little hot sauce will fix them up. I don't know. But I'm going to do what I have to do to get through. Why? It's not about slogging through it. It's about allowing the experience to make me a better person so that when I get to the promised land, I can fully enjoy that. That I can look to God and not be looking to my experience, my strength, my resume, which is not going to help me. And that's my message today.